Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a new addition to my MTGO deck collection. As if you've been looking at any of my recent videos, um, well, you'll know that I've been playing a lot of Death Shadow, 4-color Death Shadow in Modern lately, taking a hiatus from my usual time spent messing around in the Legacy competitive leagues. And having an absolute blast with that deck. So I decided maybe I could try to see how Death Shadow will perform in a Legacy League. And so that's what you see here. Of course, you have our Force of Wills, and in our Dazes, etc. And as opposed to, I just finished a league and had some thoughts on this. But which I will cover at the end of the video. So, as opposed to what I've been playing a lot in the modern leagues, 4-color Shadow, splashing blue just for main deck Stubborn Denial and some sideboard like Disputes or Ether Gust and Ceremonious Rejection, and then like splashing red just for Temur Battle Rage. The Legacy version of Death Shadow only is 2 colors, blue and black. Blue because that's obvious, if you're trying to play a deck like Shadow, which even in the Legacy version I still have one Stubborn Denial. More about that deck choice in a little bit. And of course black for the discard and Shadow package. I've been thinking about whether I wanted to make it a Sultai or a Bug Shadow list so I can get Berserk mostly. Berserk, of course, probably an even stronger Temur Battle Rage, it being 1 mana and requiring less splashes than Modern if it existed, but considered trying it in Legacy. Decided not to go for it. I reviewed some old Legacy Shadow videos from like LSV and Manguchi, where they were playing with Shadow, and very frequently, the way the format worked out, the decks where you really would normally want like a Temur Battle Rage effect, you're more actually concerned about just trying to keep your board intact. Because after all, Death Shadow, it's a 13/13 for 1 mana, but it gets -X, where X is the life total. So anytime a Death Shadow is hit with a Swords to Plowshares, your life total automatically jumps to 13 and it immediately destroys any other Shadow you see. And other sources of life gain obviously can be a problem, and actually we see some really funny examples in this league. But anyway, didn't really feel like watching the videos there was any time or any safe time to sort of try to steal a game with Temur Battle Rage. So my initial thoughts, I guess, really quickly playing the deck. It operates on ridiculously thin margins, and every game kind of felt ugly, yet somehow managed to close out with a winning 3-2 record. Not too sure if I'm going to keep playing this in Legacy. It was fun experiment, but we'll see. No promises. Notable cards in the deck. Again, only one Stubborn Denial, simply because there are so many cards that you have to answer before Stubborn Denial comes on. So instead, there's a Force Negation and 5 Force of Wills. I did keep the Stubborn Denial because, well, the 2-for-1s are so painful in the set because there's absolutely zero way to regain card value. I still wanted a way to like have a late game like counter or removal spell, especially like a Swords to Plowshares, without needing like another blue card in my hand. So I decided to keep one Stubborn Denial as a 1 mana Force Negation, basically. Beyond that, other notables, Snuff Out is pretty standard for Death Shadow list. If you control a swamp, you may pay 4 life rather than pay the mana cost, and you can destroy target non-black creature. It's Death Shadow and so people say that that Death Shadow decks in Modern are sort of like the modern equivalent of Legacy Delver decks. They're both like tempo decks. So unsurprisingly, the Death Shadow equivalent in Legacy does have Delver Secrets. which I also found to be a bit of a tug of war, where the Delver strategy is deploy your threat and then protect it early while it beats face, while generally Shadow is sort of seen as reverse Delver, where you play your disruption, like our Thought Seizes here, and then you put your pressure. So obviously those two don't go super well together, but generally what it tries to do is have early pressure with the Delver while disrupting, and then once the opponent answers a Delver, as they usually do, try to follow up with a giant Death Shadow to close the game. Interesting new addition to the deck is Eliminate. 2 mana black instant, destroy target creature or planeswalker with a converted mana cost 3 or less. This is a new card from Core Set 2021, and its main use is definitely that you don't need to splash green. Again, I'm thinking about whether I can in this list, but currently don't need a splash green so while still having an abrupt decay sort of effect. Killing Oko of Eliminate is definitely the goal here, although killing 3 mana Teferi is also good. And of course it kills creatures, most creatures in the format. No Reanimate in this list. I decided to have a different threat package with Brazen Borrower, simply because it is kind of like, when you're trying to be a tempo deck, the petty theft side of Brazen Borrower seemed really good. Plus, it then turns into an evasive threat later in the game. Many Delver decks have been playing Brazen Borrower since the card was printed in Throne of Eldraine, but especially it seemed really right for a Death Shadow deck, because in Legacy, because it folds super hard to Chalice of the Void. You can see we have Brainstorms, we have Delvers, Ponders, Shadows, Thoughtseizes, like 21. So like over half of the deck, non-lands of the deck, are 1 mana spells. So Brazen Borrower has some nice utility. The sideboard, nothing surprising. Some Winter Warps to try to shut down control decks. Some graveyard interaction with the Cage and the Surgical. Against grindy decks, I have Narset and Hymn to Torok to try to turn off some of my opponent's cantrips and maybe get some 2-for-1s. Plague Engineer, All-Star, obviously, in any black deck, hosing all the Legacy X1s. Hydroblast, mostly I brought in for Temur Delver, because Dreadhorde Arcanist is like one of the most powerful cards that Delver decks have been able to exploit in the past year, and having more answers to it, especially when they're pressuring my life total, where Snuff Out or Eliminate's a little clunky. Anyway, you get the idea. And this is my favorite one, Contentious Plan. 2 mana sorcery, so it flips Delver, fun fact. It's also a blue spell you can pitch, but it is a 2 mana sorcery that plays around Chalice that proliferates and draws a card. So this is, most decks run like Ratchet Bomb or Engineered Explosives just to answer Chalice of the Void. It's so bad. But to me, though, like especially Ratchet Bomb seems so bad against anything else other than Chalice. I'm like, why not play a card that answers Chalice while also preventing the opponent from catching future Chalices, since now Chalice will be on 2, so they can no longer cast Chalice on 1, and it draws me a card, and it flips the Delver. Yeah, very narrow, but a very popular card in the Legacy format that is very, 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 very important to answer for this deck. So I have some recorded games, which I'll share. Yeah, we'll see if they feel any better looking back on them. All right, match 1. On the draw, opponent and I both keep 7. The opponent plays Misty, which of course can mean anything. Snow-covered island, Astrolabe immediately. No, this is one of the harder matchups for Shadow. Basically any fair deck. Though Snoko so easily feels like it should so easily go over the top. So not a great start. Opponent with their simple Astrolabe also plays around Wasteland, an important part of this deck. Important to note, if you watched my Modern Shadow videos, I would effectively use discard to try to make my control opponent's hand clunky. But when you have a format with Brainstorm and Ponder, it's very easy for them to recover from a discard spell. Plus, they're playing Swords to Plowshares and Force of Will and Force Negation. So it's hard to try to be the more efficient. Excuse me. It's hard to push that mana efficiency in this format. But all right, Delver, actually just absolutely the best draw I can get to get my pressure on. Tip my hat to the opponent pretty early with a Watery Grave, but that's okay. Opponents wonder what the opponent's thinking. Opponent plays main deck Carpet of Flowers, which is a huge beating for any Delver deck, and I seriously considered whether I was going to Force of Will. In hindsight, I probably should have, because Daze isn't going to do anything when there's a Carpet of Flowers, but I decided not to because I really wanted to have a force for like an Ogo or something terrifying, as opposed to something that makes mana and makes my days bad, which I could just pitch to Force of Will. And 2-for-1ing myself, again, would put me down to 5 cards. A hand of Angler, Ponder, and 2 fetch lands just doesn't seem very strong. Reveal Stumber Denial. Again, feeling kind of sheepish playing that spell in the format, but I do have the Angler, so I'm hoping that at some point I can resolve it with Stumber Denial backup, which seemed pretty strong. Fetch before the Ponder, since I have another fetch in play to get some selection. And I almost kept this, the top of Shadow, Delver, Angler. I believe, yeah, I decided to shuffle it because if I drew Delver and played it, I wouldn't have a way to flip it the next turn, so it would just be a 1-mana 1/1, which is not very appealing. And Death Shadow, playing against Snow Code, I didn't see any Swords to Plowshares yet, and I was like, there's no way they won't have it. And if I played Death Shadow this turn as a 1/1, a Swords to Plowshare on the Insectile Aberration would simply result in me getting 2-for-1, which is obviously horrendous. So I opted to shuffle, draw a Shadow anyway. So I play it, and thankfully, I play it anyway because I have nothing else to do with my mana. But thankfully, the opponent actually forces it, meaning to me, oh, they don't have Swords to Plowshares, and also they pitch Narset, which is a card I'm always happy to not see my opponent running around with. Opponent still has 4 cards. And they play Monastery Mentor, which is a very terrifying card, actually, especially in Legacy where you have so many cantrips. To me, this felt like something I had to answer. Opt to go Force of Will, pitching Daze, simply because Daze is pretty useless with Carpet of Flowers, and of course, Angler plus Stumber Denial is a very strong synergy. Opponent forces back, so pitching a second Force of Will, or their third, I guess. So good news, bad news. Bad news is Monastery Mentor resolves here. Good news is the opponent has 0 cards, and I still have Angler coming up, followed by Stumber Denial. Opponent fetched, I assume, to play around potential stifles. Cycle Street Wraith into Underground Sea, which feels pretty bad. But here to cast Angler. There's no other graveyard synergies other than Delving, but I leave Shadow behind. And now I have Angler plus Stumber Denial, which actually feels pretty good when the opponent just has Mentor and no cards in hand. So like even no matter basically anything they're playing, I'm going to Stubborn Denial here, just especially if it's a cantrip. Basically, I want to stop their cantrips so they don't explode with the Mentor. I want to counter any Planeswalkers, obviously. So actually feeling pretty good. Opponent with 1 card in hand, and I have Stubborn Denial. So who would have thought Stubborn Denial is looking good in the Legacy format? The opponent proceeds to do nothing, which is brilliant. And then I draw Eliminate, which also a very strong draw, meaning that even if the opponent for some reason has an answer in front of my Eliminate to get a Monastery Mentor trigger, my Stumber Denial means that, yes, with 1 card in the opponent's hand, this Eliminate is going to resolve. So they'll be left with a 1/1 prowess, which doesn't line up well against my board. Yeah, we're really seeing the effect of opponent going double Force of Will this game. Basically, mold themselves to 5. Yeah, running out of cards. And yeah, they don't have an answer. So it's feeling very strong. Opponent is dead in 1 hit. And it has nothing. So surprisingly good showing from the Shadow deck. Figured it was too good to be true, but was surprised it worked out like such. I guess, you know, any game where the opponent forces too many times is a good one. I guess I should have talked about this hand. The deck only plays 18 lands. That's pretty stock. And Wasteland in the deck is not a land. It is just a spell. It doesn't really cast anything. Now I guess with Brazen Borrow, which I ended up boarding out, it kind of might be able to help with that, but really it doesn't really cast any spells meaningfully. And of course they're an Astrolabe deck. So that means I only had 15 lands in the deck. Or if you're, again, if we're saying Wasteland is only a spell and not a land, then we're at 14. So between having a relatively quote-unquote high density of land and also figuring for the sake of science, and also this hand is very strong for a Shadow deck, as long as I can find my first blue source. Basically having my draw step and Street Wraith, I figured, whatever, I'm going to go for it. Wasn't sure how to board. I didn't really know what I was looking at. I took out some forces because, as we saw, 2-for-1s can be very liable in a fair matchup. I feel like they didn't have any hate cards they wanted to answer with Brazen Borrower. Instead, I brought in my Hymns, my Winter Orbs, and Hymn to Tourach to try to get some good value. But anyway, get rewarded drawing a land immediately. But obviously super sketch, but I figured the matchup was so bad. My highest chance to win was keeping the solid 7 and hoping I get a land in the top 2 rather than going to 6 and already being down. Winter was okay. You need to deploy your threat, get your opponent to tap out, stop them whatever they tap out for, and then resolve the Winter Orb. But, you know, it could be good later. Most importantly, of course, I have my first land. I get a Ponder. No, I get a. Yep, I knew that. I get a Thoughtseize, and sort of like in Modern, I want to take the cheap white removal spell, especially since Swords to Plowshares is just a nightmare for this deck. Lightning Bolt doesn't look very good against the deck. Would love to take Brainstorm, but you know, I have to take the card that I know will cause me problems. Opponent plays the Astrolabe and does nothing else. Good. Draw my second land. So I'm happy to. Opponent didn't really brainstorm, so I know their hand is Brainstorm, Bolt, and Vista. So I felt happy trying to go for Hymn to Tourach. But unfortunately, the opponent in the 2 draws since I last saw their hand, and with a basic mountain of all things, tilting, got the Veil. So they get their nice 2-for-1 instead of vice versa. Feels bad, understandable why Death Shadow's on the decline, but still seemed like a good reason to go for it. Opponent decides to play Flutterstrand instead of Vista, so I know more information still, and they play Young Pyromancer, which doesn't look very good again, which doesn't line up super well against Shadow unless I have a removal for it really quickly. Now that they're basically ahead, this Winter Orb is kind of useless, and I thankfully find Snuff Out. So I'm excited that I can basically play 2 Shadows. I decided to keep Winter Orb, just looking ahead, which in hindsight probably wasn't the best. But my life total is low enough that I didn't really need the Street Wraith, so I figured, yeah, I'll just have Winter Orb, whatever. Opponent manages to Brainstorm to get some value off the Young Pyromancer, and probably trying to find an answer for the Snuff Out. And they don't find it, so already feeling good. Fetch Underground Seeks, my life total is low enough, and deploy 2 5/5s. So now I'm against an opponent's basically unknown hand. It's not unlikely to think they have a Bolt and a Vista somewhere, especially if they show a fetch, but they don't. So I know between this turn and next turn, they're still going to be stuck with a Vista and Bolt. But the fact they had Vista and didn't use it right then made me think that they liked all the cards they saw from Brainstorm, which is not a good sign. Yeah, makes sense. They had another Young Pyromancer. And without Temur Battle Rage, like, these tokens are doing an effective job. Decide to Thoughtseize first to clear the way for interaction. So like try to ponder into like another Snuff Out or something. And yeah, opponent still had Bolt, so they decided to put me down to 5 and make another token. And then I would be going down to 3 and showing only a hand of Prismatic Vista Tropical Island. And now I'm like, oof, I'm at 3 life. And my best answers for Young Pyromancer cost me 4 life. In hindsight, I think I should have just pondered, especially since this was a punt. I should have just pondered trying to find more interaction to get rid of the Young Pyromancer, especially since the opponent had an untapped land, got to untap 1 land for their turn, and cast this and play a 3rd land to have 3 mana next turn, and all they need to do is just play these 1 mana cantrips. So huge punt on my part. Not sure how I feel about Winter Orb. Raga Delver lists love playing it, so I'm sure it could be good if I utilized it better. But you know, Oko can't really beat that. You know, I made all this effort to make these 10/10s, and in exchange I get Elk, but opponent doesn't even need to do that. They just have lethal on board from Oko. So everyone's favorite Planeswalker takes game. Everyone's favorite Planeswalker and the Young Pyromancer takes game 2. Alright, game 3. Thankfully I'm on the play. Hand seems good enough. Has some days, which they're definitely going to play around, but at least I have it. Obviously would like some pressure to try to get them to play into it. But of course, you know, you have your brainstorms to try and fix this hand to do something interesting. Opponent leads off with the famous and well-beloved Astrolabe. Draw a Delver, which I wish I had last turn, but I'm still pretty happy about. I want to brainstorm anyway because I have a land that I don't want and still see more cards I don't want, like the other land. Death Shadow, until you bring in your 3-drops, definitely is a deck that truthfully runs on 2 lands. But put back an extra Brainstorm because Brainstorm is a card I want to draw later in the game to basically turn into an Ancestral Recall. So I'm happy to shuffle it away, looking in the long term, and deploy my Delver. Pyroblast, can't fight over it, wouldn't fight over it if I could. Thinking about it, you know, I could have brought in Hydroblast, but again, new to this deck, wasn't really sure, didn't really feel like it was worth bringing in Hydroblast just for Lightning Bolt, but as an answer to Pyroblast, maybe? That seems like super situational. I mostly wanted it where I would know it would hit important cards every matchup, like Delver, like Blue-Red X, Temur, or whatever. So, would have been good there if I had the mana for it. Angler is fine, mostly just looking to deploy my threats. Don't really have much I want to shuffle away with my Brainstorm yet, so I'm happy just passing. And then if the Delver survives, I was looking to Brainstorm on the end step to guarantee to flip, but opponent has a Bolt, and I'm like, that's fine. Like, now that I have Angler, I'm feeling fine. They're answering my threats. And again, I keep Winter Orb, hoping that I can put down my threat, and then shut down my opponent's mana. Find Death Shadow and Thoughtseize, which is pretty good. So, looking to disrupt the opponent, but the opponent ends up 2-for-1ing me, except I have the Daze, thank goodness. So Daze is looking good now. And I see this very scary hand of Brainstorm Ponder. Again, discard spells not super effective in this deck. Like, discard spells out of Storm or Reanimator or Depths feels really good because there's limited ways the opponent can interact with you. But in this deck, you need to deal with Planeswalkers, you need to deal with creatures, you need to deal with counter magic, you need to deal with removal. Like, everything's good against this deck because I'm a fair deck. So, like, this Thoughtseize doesn't feel like it's doing much. Sure, I end up taking Jace here. It's the scariest card. But I'm still presented with the problem of the opponent can just fix their hand, and I just trade 1-for-1 that doesn't really do much. Would have been nice if if I had like a Daze or something, because then I could have then countered a future Jace the Mind Sculptor, and then that's when you follow up with Winter Orb. But I didn't feel my hand was that strong enough for that play. Thankfully, Eliminate can answer Narset. So the opponent's hand is Narset, Ponder, Brainstorm, which, to be honest, for a 3-card hand that just got Thoughtseize is really good. And then they top deck Carpet of Flowers, which solves all their mana problems. So at least I got use out of Daze when I could have. And then the card we lost to last game, Young Pyromancer. They get value immediately off of it, so now I know their hand. They likely kept a Narset somewhere in their hand or top 2 cards. And they didn't present a shuffle, so there's no reason to click that away. Nothing to do but to attack. And they're happy, of course, to block with a 1/1. Winter Orb also looking really bad because now it's asymmetrical since their Carpet generates 3 mana every turn. Hoping to eliminate, and they have Spell Pierce. So, game's basically over at this point. They're going to untap with Young Pyromancer and probably a Narset. Without me having a way to crash through with a Berserk or a Temur Battle Rage. And to make matters worse, like, opponent just has Oko. So, at that point I decide there's no coming back. So I scoop. You know, game felt fine, but you could really see discard in a fair deck doesn't really feel good enough in Legacy, especially with Veil of Summers running around, but just the fact that my opponent has a bunch. Me being a fair deck means my opponent's interaction all can do things that are relevant for them against me. While in Modern, you can easily use your discard spells to make your opponents basically have hands that play out poorly. Unkeepable. And same logic I had last time. You know, I have 18 lands in the deck, 14 real lands. I would be very upset to draw a Wasteland. I'm on the draw, so I have 2 draws, and I'm like mulling to 5 when it's so easy for decks to go over the top of me, of a Shadow deck in Legacy. Didn't really feel like a winning strategy. And if I draw any land, I'm basically set up with my 2 cantrips, plus Street Wraith and a Thread and a removal spell, so have my fingers crossed. The opponent goes Wooded Foothills Go, which is encouraging. It doesn't really feel like a blue deck. Draw the Thoughtseize. Street Wraith does not find the land, so obviously there's a fail rate, a very high one, obviously. Opponent's probably judging us for keeping a no-lander, but again, I'm ult to 6, mulling to 5, didn't really feel like a winning strategy. format where, again, I very frequently 2-for-1 myself, and then immediately, oh hey, it's Infect, a deck I was considering playing, wondering if it was Legacy's true equivalent to modern Death Shadow, since it is basically a tempo deck, plays Force Will, plays Daze, with a Berserk finish. Have some thoughts on that too, but I don't need to share that here. Just focus on the video. Wasteland was okay. I decided to Wasteland immediately instead of waiting for the opponent to activate it, because they can activate it and then protect it with like a Vines of Vastwood. So I'm just happy to get rid of it now while the opponent doesn't have an Infect creature in play. Spoke too soon, but I'm like, hey, you know, as long as I can find a black source, I'll be okay. Obviously, don't find the black source. Figure my hand is actually like decent. Again, it's missing the mana, the colored mana source, but decided my hand doesn't really need Brainstorm fixing. It has lots of action, and the opponent is presenting something that tells me I don't have a lot of time to dirtle, so I discard Brainstorm. Don't know if that was the right call. Probably wasn't, actually, considering I have 3 threats. Probably should have discarded either Delver, one of my threats. Sylvan Library, good job, opponent. They're going to draw lots of cards. And they give me life with Invigorate. Thank you very much. So I'm at 7 Infect. Finally draw a land that boosts color. And nice thing about Snuff Out, you can have 1 land in play and play around Daze. And I'm undoing the life gain, the damage they've done in terms of life gain from Invigorate, putting myself all the way to 14, excuse me. From that, decided Thoughtseize if they Daze. Sorry, I decided Delver, and if they Daze it, I don't really care. An opponent doesn't seem to care about it either, but I feel like it's unlikely that they don't have interaction, although they are at 2 cards in hand, so it is possible. Again, opponent doesn't have an Infect, which is nice, but they do have Sylvan Library, which is scary at them being 9 life, 19 life. And they draw 2 cards from it, and play another threat, so looking not great. Opponent's back to 4 after it was feeling pretty good at them being at 2. Revealing Summer Denial, which is like okay. No point in hanging back with the Insectile Aberration, but really looking for another removal spell. I see Daze, Delver, Thoughtseize. Nope, need a removal spell, and I don't find it. So I guess I have to hope the opponent doesn't kill me next turn, which doesn't seem, but then I realize it's impossible. Between Pendelhaven, Noble Hierarch, Exalted Trigger, I was like, yeah, they can deal me 3 Infect, and there's no reason they'll hang back. I can't block it, and I don't have removal, so. 1-1 against 0-1 against Infect. Keeping in questionable hand. Again, maybe it would have been better to mold a 5. 14 colored mana sources feels very low for the deck. But that's sort of the conventional wisdom. Hand's okay. Wasteland for their Nexus, turn 1 Delver, and then Brainstorm to try to make action. Funnily enough, in the matchup, like, life total does matter, because even though they're dealing me Infect damage, if I end up answering all their Infect creatures, and they just have a Noble Hierarch left in play, it's like, oh, they could just kill me as if it were an Infect creature, because they only have to deal like 10 or less damage. They Wasteland my Watergrave, which thankfully have another fetch. So now the opponent's behind, but I draw Plague Engineer, which is feeling very far away from casting that, between having 1 land and then a Wasteland, which I don't plan to keep around. So I'll just deploy another Delver, why not, and hope they both flip next turn, because then that'll be a pretty good clock. Right, blind flipping Delivers is pretty easy in Legacy, but first one reveals Underground Sea, so no flip. And trying to flip the second one, I decided to brainstorm during draw step. Again, trying to close out the day game. And ended up drawing, of course, the Underground Sea I knew, the second Underground Sea, and the Brazen Borrower. So I'm looking at my hand and I'm like, great. This deck is wonderful. I have two 1/1s, two 1/1s, two 1-mana 1/1s in play that are not going to flip for the next 2 turns after this. And I have no way to get my life total lower. Basically, I'm banking on casting Plague Engineer down the road, bouncing their threat while I try to make land drops into Plague Engineer and Wasteland. Yeah, so like not bad, but definitely not great by any stretch. So it doesn't really matter what I put. Hand is trash. And the opponent, yeah, has to know. He didn't flip his Delver and didn't shuffle. Yeah, those Delvers are not flipping forever. So I think that was more unlucky. They just play Wasteland, which is good for me. Lines up well against... sorry, they play Inkmoth Nexus, which lines up well for me. Plays well against my Wasteland. They play Carpet, which is unfortunate. But thankfully, they can't use that mana to attack, but they can use that mana to Swords a 1/1, which is fine. In fact, maybe I'm glad it wasn't a 3/3. This is interesting. They play Rest in Peace. And I feel like that was maybe an error on this part. The only graveyard card I have in my whole deck is Gurmag Angler, and that's 2 copies. So I'm very happy that they spent their entire turn, playing this 2 mana, basically do nothing. Of course, the Delver's not going to flip. But I definitely Wasteland now, again, to play around, now that they have Carpet, to play around the possibility of activating Nexus in response to Wasteland and Vines of Vastwood. And I'm feeling okay. I have my medium interaction of Petty Theft. They play another Inkmoth Nexus. I'm like, maybe this is why I ended up doing okay in this match. The opponent plays Great Sable Stack. 3 mana 3/3 Elk, can't be countered. Protection from blue and from black. So it's protection from my deck, but it's a 3 mana 3/3. Like, I remember my friend Kevin and I would joke about this card as anti-Oko tech, because it can't be countered and it can't be elked. Joke is, it is a 3/3 elk to begin with. I'm not really sure why this card is ever worth it. Sorry, Kevin, but sure, you can have your 3/3 elk, and in fact, if you start attacking me with it, it just makes my Death Shadow better. So I'm relatively happy with this play. And if my Delver flips, then I could keep pressuring them, ignoring the Great Sable Stag. And finally, the Delver flips, revealing Brainstorm. Definitely the best draw on the deck right now. Unfortunately, don't find any way to fetch. But I do have a way to basically stack my deck such that I will draw I will flip both this is my second Delver this next turn. So I put back those puppies. And it doesn't really matter what I put on top, because I'm going to draw the Brainstorm next turn. I'm going to resolve the Brainstorm next turn. So I'm going to draw the Petty Theft, which matters. And I'm not going to cast Petty Theft this turn. So it didn't really matter as long as the Brainstorm was on top and Daze was in my hand. Although, again, Daze with a Carpet in play and me doesn't really seem worth it. But you never know. Seemed to be the only objectively correct thing to do. Oh, excuse me. And there is the Blighted Agent. So I'd be very happy to have Plague Engineer. However, the opponent only has 1 card in hand because they spent so many things just like answering nothing, right? You know, at the time, Carpet Flowers didn't surprise me. But in hindsight, it feels like that's not... Like, I obviously love this card. I play it in blue-green, in fact. Sorry, blue-green Omnitel. But in a deck like Infect, where you have a lot of your efficient threats, Glistener Elf, though I didn't see any Glistener Elves this game, Ink Moth, Blight Agent, whatever, and then like cards like Invigorate and Daze and Force Will that are all free. Like, I didn't really understand what this carpet was for. Like, I would use carpets basically to hard cast Griselbrand or hard cast Omniscience, or have enough mana to play around Daze while still having Veil mana and Show and Tell. But like, it was still not clear to me what this carpet mana was being used for. And if the answer is Great Sable Stag, I don't know, you should just be playing Shifting Ceratops. Anyone who watches my Legacy videos know how much I love that card. Of course, reveal the Brainstorm. So now they're on a 2-turn clock, and their Great Sable Stag turned on my Death Shadow. This was actually a misclick. I meant to just cast Plague Engineer to kill the Blighted Agent, but accidentally clicked the wrong black card. Thankfully, I was not at or above 13 life, so it resolved. Didn't feel too bad because I'm still happy brainstorming, and it seemed unlikely unless my opponent's hand was exactly Invigorate and then they drew Berserk for turn. So I didn't feel like I was dead next turn anyway. So I brainstorm, find some Thoughtseize and eliminate. Yeah, and I Thoughtseize away. Sorry about that. Their only card in hand, which was so I kept Thoughtseize and then eliminate and put back the other cards, and Thoughtseize to reveal Flusterstorm, which they were happy to not counter because I think they wanted to race me, which seems counterintuitive when I have a Death Shadow. But sure, your Great Sable Stag can try to race a Death Shadow. Wasteland their Inkmoth Nexus, which they not Wasteland. They block my Insectile Aberration with Inkmoth Nexus. So they have another one. Yeah, if you want to race Great Sable Stag, if you want to use their 3/3 Elk to raise my now 6/6 Shadow, when this is the only source of regular damage, I don't know. It felt like a loose play, and I was feeling good having Eliminates. Especially since opponent had 0 cards, so this Plague Engineer was going to resolve and kill Blighted Agent, which meant that Inkmoth Nexus had to block Death Shadow so that they wouldn't die, which is exactly what happens. Death Shadow's still big. And then now they need to top deck a removal spell because I have them dead on board. And they don't. So, Strange Game 2. Not sure if Great Sable Stag is a good sideboard card against any deck, but you are welcome to play it. I was tempted to write in the chat to the opponent, hey, if you like Plan Bs, you should try playing Shifting Ceratops. Very good with Carpet of Flowers. On the draw for Game 3. Keep an acceptable hand. It's not great. In fact, one could say it's pretty bad, but based on how the opponent was playing, it seems they're really going for the long game, trying to grind me out. So I figure just having 7 cards, especially when Street Wraith can draw into a card like Brainstorm, or I could just, naturally draw Brainstorm. I cycle to hopefully find Thoughtseize. I don't. I find a Water Grave and instantly wish I fetched first, but I want to keep this fetch for next turn anyway. So opponent brainstorms and shuffles and does nothing, so again, feeling good. Drawing these cantrips feels amazing. I have some dead cards in my hand, so I'm happy to brainstorm and shuffle them away, finding a lot of good interaction. So I'm missing one thing, I'm missing a threat, but I still have the Ponder, and I get a free shuffle here. So I book back 2 lands, and then Thoughtseize, and the opponent Flusterstorms, which is fine. As long as they're not 2-for-1ing me with Veil, they can 1-for-1 me with Spell Pierce or Flusterstorm. Denies them the ability to protect their creature down the road. And here's a Blighted Agent. I decide not to force it. A, obviously the 2-for-1's bad. B, I can eliminate it next turn and play a Wasteland to play around Daze, so I let it resolve. Plus I have my own Daze such that if they tried to Veil or Vines of Vastwood, I could Daze it, which felt pretty good. More cantrips is fine, looking for a threat. Step 1, play my removal spell around Daze. Opponent coming in with a Veil of Summer. We take those, very happy to Daze it. And then now I'm pretty sure this is going to resolve. Opponent has 3 cards in hand. So even if they force it, I'll force it back, and then they'll be left with 1 card, so the opponent lets it resolve. Brainstorm, always a good one. Decide not to force it. Obviously, I want to force the important cards. And here's what I'm talking about. I'm at 11 life, so this Noble Hierarch only has to deal me like 10-ish damage, basically, as if it were an infect creature. So I'm a little nervous. I'm pinning my opponent on having Daze, so I decided not to play Plague Engineer into it. So I'd rather just sculpt my hand and find an alternate threat, such as Death Shadow. So very happy to have found it. And more Dazes to follow up on. So now I have my nice 4/4. Decide, since I know I'm drawing Daze, I want to pinch them on their mana a little bit. Obviously, that makes it hard for me to cast Plague Engineer. I don't have lands on the top 2 cards in my deck. Swords to Plowshares. I could have forced it, but I decided that's okay. It makes it harder for them to pseudo infect me with Noble Hierarch, and I still have another threat in cantrips coming up, so the longer I can put off having to use Force of Will, the better I feel about how this matchup's going to go, so I let them plow it. It's fine. Draw the Daze I know about, and find another Shadow, more interaction. I decide to shuffle because I'm at 13 life. Really looking for like Delver or Angler. I decide, since I'm not playing a land anymore, I decide a Brainstorm and Thoughtseize are better than 2 random cards, because basically between the Ponder Draw and Draw for turn, I'm going to draw past those first 2 top cards, so the Brainstorm will be looking at 2 fresh cards after the 3rd one, so I figure it's better than a random card. Keep the Force of Will for... So now I can force pitch Stomp Denial or force pitch Daze if they play like a Blighted Agent or a Glistener Elf. Again, I haven't seen Glistener Elf this entire match, which makes me think maybe they don't have it, which would be dumb, but here you are. And I find my threats. Decide to put back, decide to go with Thoughtseize now, because I feel like between 4 cards, the opponent probably has a lot of interaction. And they do, they Daze, which, again, I'm happy about. Pinches their mana, and I feel kind of ahead in a strange way with this double force and some good threats coming up. And here comes the Blight Agent. So what I talked about, double Force of Will, I would be very happy to trade a Force of Will for either their Force of Will or a Daze, but they already dazed my Thoughtseize. So they didn't have a second one, and I still have Force of Will in hand. And now it's time to deploy double threats. Sure, opponent has Swords to Plowshares, but I actually, sorry, this was a mistake. I actually decided not to play Delver. The opponent felt a little pinched on mana, so I could Daze it, plus me playing around Daze by basically being able to cast Force of Will without having to worry about Daze seemed good. The opponent attacks, and I'm like, you know you're growing my Shadow, right? And I figured, okay, this probably means they have like a pump spell, in which case, if they have a pump spell, so I guess this is what my thinking, why I didn't play Delver. I'd want to be able to Force a Will and play around Daze, because if they attack, I don't want to block because it's a 1/1, and hopefully I'm hoping here they try to go for lethal with their 4 remaining cards, and that I can basically take off just enough, like their second or third pump spell, such that my Death Shadow gets really big, but I'm still alive, and now they're on the back foot. Opponent goes for Invigorate, which is hilarious. So I was mentioning life gain as a drawback in this deck. So yeah, I go from 12 to 15. It kills my Shadow, and the opponent hits me for 5, puts me back down to 10. Good job, opponent. Joke's on me. Again, the Play Engineer, that's been stuck in my hand for eons, so I just play the Delver. And now I think I'm into the territory of having new cards off the top of my deck. Looking to flip this Delver. Opponent draws Nexus, which is a little scary. Thankfully, I'm at 0 poison, so they have a little work to do. Reveal Brainstorm, perfect. Flip the Delver. Brainstorm, of course, try to find something. Wasteland was an amazing draw. I decided to keep Force Will and Daze in hand, again, as force food for Daze being force food. And I decide I want to Wasteland the Inkmoth Nexus now, such that even if they have like Vines of Vastwood, they would be spending it on my turn to protect it rather than giving it +4/+4 on their turn, which would be harder for me to survive. So I'm happy to trade Wasteland either hopefully for their Nexus, but if not, then for their Vines of Vastwood that I figure they might have, since, you know, they have 3 cards that aren't doing anything. What could they possibly have? They have to have like interaction, right? So it seemed pretty likely. And if they were spending their Vines of Vastwood just to protect Inkmoth Nexus and not getting the damage bonus for their turn, I felt like I could comfortably race it with this Gurmag Angler and my flipped Delver. So I put back the uncastable cards. Perhaps mistakenly, I decided not to play around. Because I'm like, you know what? I can block Noble Hierarch if they attack, but in hindsight, maybe that was not the best idea. But as predicted, anyway, the opponent has the Vines, and I'm like, that's fine. Now they can't block with the Inkmoth Nexus. So again, maybe in hindsight, they should have used the other mana to give me a bad attack. And the opponent hits me for 2. And I'm looking at their 2 cards, I'm like, the only thing that kills me now is Invigorate and Berserk. So hopefully they don't have it. They already spent an Invigorate, and they don't pump it at all. So I'm feeling very good now. Oh yeah, that's right. Instead of keeping Force Food, I wanted to put Daze with, instead of keeping Daze in hand for Force Will food. Yeah, at the time, I decided it was better to put it on top of my deck to increase my clock, because it was the only instant. Because my top 2 cards are Daze and Plague Engineer, so I'd rather that they know about the Daze than Force of Will. And I want to flip this Delver to try to just end this game. So now I'm feeling pretty good. I have basically they're dead on board, and opponent has 3 cards in hand, 2 cards in hand, so what they have on board is not lethal, and unless they have like Flusterstorm is their only way. So let's see, they can make this 2, 3, but yeah, even if they had Invigorate or Berserk, the only thing that really gets me is like Scale Up or Become Immense, and the fact that but I can play around one of those cards as long as they don't have Flusterstorm. So I decided to take it, that's fine. And now the opponent is priced into blocking with Noble Hierarch, which makes it harder for them to kill me in return, since I have Uber Mega Lethal in play. So now the opponent only has 2 Infect represented. They need to scrape up 3 more through a Force of Will, so again, feeling pretty good. And the opponent tries to Vines of Vastwood. And I can thankfully force playing around Daze, and the only thing that will save them now is exactly Force of Will, because at this point I can pay for Flusterstorm, and the opponent doesn't have Force of Will. So managed to get there against Infect. Next matchup is a little frustrating. As you saw, I lost the matchup. Currently on the draw, unkeepable. I decided to keep a hand. Oops, excuse me. Hold on. Sorry about that. That was no bueno. Alright, back to this matchup. Game 1. On the draw, no lands. Mold to 6. On the draw, no lands. Again, Wasteland's a spell, but I'm like, well, it worked out for me once and didn't work out for me for the second time. But again, I think mulling to 5 with this deck is just lights out in so many matchups. And again, I have basically all my draws, all my lands, and then that will turn on my cantrips, which will just make me sort of do okay. So I decide to put back the Angler, since I already have a Delver Threat, and just pray that the top 2 cards on my deck, one of them's a land. Underground Sea, I'm like, is it the mirror? I feel like that's unlikely. I decided to cycle Street Wraith, since basically that's the card most likely to get me to land, brick on land, and decide not to force it. Opponent takes Force of Will and plays Lion's Eye Diamond, and immediately I'm like, okay, Storm. So as soon as I draw land, I will be in okay shape. Don't draw land, so at least I'll try to tax their mana a little bit. Made sense they played Lion's Eye Diamond now, because if I top deck the land and I would discard it, it would be bad. Opponent, if I recall, put 2 cards at the bottom of the Preordain, which made me happy, and boom. So not bad. Like, I played land on turn 1, which I used effectively, and then found a colored mana source on turn 2. Considering between Thoughtseize and Daze, the fact they went bottom on their Preordain led me think, Storm can be fast, but they're pretty often a rather slow deck, so I was actually happy to first deploy my pressure, and then Thoughtseize on the next turn. But then the opponent plays Lotus Petal, which immediately tells me, uh-oh, Dark Ritual, and we'll just play through the turn. They take my Brainstorm, Past in Flames, and I'm dead. I want to point out, I skipped through the combo because whatever. What happened was opponent basically the opponent played Lotus Petal and then correct Lion's Eye Diamond to basically make enough mana to flash back a Past in Flames they had in hand. And then they had 0 cards in hand, but Past in Flames. So their only way to try to get out of it was to Preordain, since they knew I had a Thoughtseize coming up. And the Preordain put both cards to the bottom, which meant the card they drew off the flashback to Preordain was the Tendrils. So good job, opponent. They knew that a Thoughtseize was coming up that they probably felt like they couldn't beat. So they just went for it, and it worked out. People say Death Shadow's best matchup is combo. Well, pressure, cantrip, fast shadow, yeah, seems about as good as the deck gets. Opponent ponders and doesn't shuffle. Find another shadow. In hindsight, what I should have done, I felt so dumb. I should have cycled Street Wraith first, since I have the ability to shuffle cards away with Brainstorm, so I should have been able to see more cards. I felt good about finding Daze, but the extra land was not good, so I put back land, Street Wraith. No, what did I put back? Whatever. Land Shadow, that's right. On the other hand, I have 3 draws to try to find something. And I decide to cycle as many Street Wraiths as I can, try to find a discard spell, which I do. They veil it, and I'm very happy to Daze, of course. So, opponent has a very good Thoughtseize proof hand. 2 cantrips, and their hand felt good enough that taking Brainstorm over Ponder didn't really feel like that much of a difference. And my hand is full of creatures and lands, so I didn't really care about duress. So for me, it meant somehow answering either trying to. So yeah, basically their hand was. They had 2 cantrips. They had a duress that didn't do anything, and then 2 good mana sources. I figured the most powerful one was Lion's Eye Diamond, which I take. Opponent brainstorms, and then I'm like, uh-oh. They find Lion's Eye Diamond anyway, so they go off and kill me. Kind of unfortunate. I feel like I did play it okay. I think taking Lion's Eye Diamond was the correct draw. Was the correct play with Thoughtseize, but yeah, I think we're really seeing the power of cantrips and Legacy, and you know, playing discard out of a fair deck doesn't feel super great. And yeah, I can play my threats, put 3 bodies in play, but they have 12 goblins, so they have lethal. So I scoop. Yeah, if you're gonna play discard and Legacy, I mean, I know some Delver decks play it, but it really feels like the best place for it would be the best place for it would be like a combo deck. Okay, keep a questionable hand. It felt okay enough, especially since I had so many live draws with cantrips and threats and interaction that I was like, I think this is fine. Obviously, if I keep drawing lands in my, let's see, there's 14 lands left in the deck, so I decide to keep it. Opponent mulls 6 and plays Aetherfile, and very sad that I drew Delver afterward, because yeah, this was definitely a matchup I would want to turn 1 counter their Aetherfile, then I could have wasteland. So kind of tilting to draw the blue card after they resolve their most important card in the matchup. Don't feel the need to do life total yet, so I decide to go for the Delver route instead. Try to put on enough of a clock to try to turn this game around instead of just being reactive. It's basically hoping I can make the opponent stumble. Especially since I have Thoughtseize coming up through Rishadan Port. Reveal Force Negation. Again, a little late, but at least I'm glad the Delver's flipping. Hopefully a Brainstorm at some point can make it flip. Reveal myself to be a Shadow, and Thoughtseize. They put in Mom, which is a little scary. I don't really have an answer to that in the main deck, but I do have Delver, so I can at least fly over. And their hand is really scary. I ended up taking Thalia since I figured they didn't want to hardcast Thalia on turn 2 when they could be porting me. And taking away Thalia meant they couldn't have anything to violin on turn 2, which meant that I would have to deal with Flickerwisp and Recruiter of the Guard. Maybe Flickerwisp was the right call, because Flickerwisp plus Mother of Runes seemed like death. But I take Thalia. And as expected, the opponent does nothing with Flickerwisp, Recruiter, and an Unknown. now I'm happy to Wasteland here to stop them from porting me, so I could try to get my Angler down. Again, Angler looking really bad against Mother, but at least it stops them from being offensive with Mother of Runes, while I manage to continue pushing for damage in the air with Insectile Aberration. Could have forced the Aether Vial, but I felt like it just wasn't worth it. Turn 3, whatever, Aether Vial. Doesn't really seem threatening when they already have a Vial on 3. Brainstorm being the perfect draw to try to find action and shuffle away these dead cards. And find some action. Unfortunately, I know their hand is Flicker-Wisp, Recruiter of the Guard. So attacking Thought-Seizing will just get them to play one over the other. It won't be able for me to get both. And they don't have any more lands to hit me with Wasteland. So I put it away and have the shuffle. I decided to attack first because I figured if I played Thoughtseize, the opponent would play Recruiter since it had more value for the long game. But if they felt safe, they would probably do Flicker-Wisp, which is death bad for me. Either the card's bad for me, but at least because they can but at least Recruiter is not going to get another Flicker-Wisp. And now that I forced them to activate it to flicker my Delver, at least I can make them hellbent with this Thoughtseize. And also playing an Angler, which, again, not super great when they have a Mother of Runes in play, but best I could do. This counter magic looking really bad. And the opponent basically gets there. They only draw lands, but Mother of Runes plus Flicker-Wisp is just enough. Especially as I don't flip the Delver, so I just scoop it up. Game 2 on the play. Keep an acceptable-ish hand. Have Disruption. Borrower seems decent to bounce if they have Chalice. Some Taxes decks bring in Chalice, bouncing and resetting an Aether Vial. Cantrip to find my next lands. Him seems pretty good against their deck. Play my Pressure. And the opponent does the correct play of trying to color screw me. And turns out, yeah, it was my only mana source. So unless I top deck a land right here, which I don't. Sorry, unless I top deck colored source right here, which I don't. I'm kind of stuck, but at least I have a land to play. My opponent plays Mother of Runes, which feels pretty bad. And I draw Polluted Delta. Would have liked to flip the Delver, but also I'm happy to have a colored mana source. So their hand is Council's Judgment, Mirroring Crusader, Umezawa's Jitte. All these cards pretty tough, but Mirroring Crusader straight up unbeatable for my deck. Double Strike, Protection from black. In green, but from black is good enough. So I take the card that I straight up cannot beat, the Mirroring Crusader, leading them with a Jitte and a Council's Judgment, and me having nothing to Wasteland. Attack with Delver, because I'd be happy to trade with Mom, but I know they won't block, and they don't block, so at least I get the damage in. And there's the Jitte. So Jitte, very good against my deck. Reveal, still don't manage to flip the Delver, but find my other threat. I figure the play here is if they try to equip the Jitte, I can bounce it to gain a tempo advantage. And basically using this tempo advantage, buy myself time to set up an Angler plus Shadow to try to overwhelm their Mother of Runes. Put back the Eliminates because they look pretty bad with Mother of Runes in play. And Hymn to Torok seems okay to try and strip their resources. So their hand now I know is perfect information, or almost perfect. Opponent plays Thalia, which is a perfect thing to put Jitte on, so I decide before Thalia attacks prevents me, I want to take the tempo play of bouncing the Jitte to try to set myself up to play a Shadow. And I real Thoughtseize, which is perfect. So now I can Thoughtseize and take the Jitte. And then I decided, do I want to play Angler or Shadow? I decided to play Angler because Shadow has potential to be bigger. And I know whatever one I play first, they're going to cancel his Judgment. So they play their Caracas to pay for Thalia attacks, and indeed cancels Judgment. Actually, what's its face? The Delver, which made sense because it evaded their creatures. Still happy about it because now I have Angler and Shadow, which kind of taxes, no pun intended, taxes their Mother of Runes, and their hand is Horizon Canopy and something else, so I decide I want to make them Hellbent, so I still have action with a Death Shadow and Ponder. Opponent discards Stoneforge Mystic, which is a huge pick, something to pick off with discard. And then now they can't attack profitably, and I can't either, but I do have a Shadow coming up. And I can even Wasteland the Rishadan port. Thankfully, my Brazen Borrow is on an adventure, so even in response to Rishadan port, I can just flash it in. Keep the pressure coming. Since I have Ponder, I decided to fetch now, since they're going to port me, which they do, and I'm happy to Wasteland it, so they stop doing that. And now I can start pressuring them from the air, and Snuff Out is actually okay. My life total is getting low enough that the Shadow paired with the Angler is going to make it hard for Mother of Runes to entirely stop my board. And then once Mother of Runes is tapped to give the Thalia protection as a blocker, I can Snuff It Out, the Mother of Runes. So I just, to prevent while it's tapped, can't protect itself and get rid of it forever. So the opponent is priced into blocking because 8 damage is a lot. And they give her protection, so I have a window now to cast Snuff Out. So Thalia survives, but now they're facing, without Mother of Runes, a 5/5, a 7/7, and a 3/1 flyer. So feeling pretty good now. Opponent is Hellbent thanks to Hymn to Tourach, and they don't have a good draw, so they scoop it up. So that was actually a pretty good game as far as Shadow games go. And then for match 3, hand is okay. Most importantly, it has Force of Will and a blue card, so I can answer a turn 1 Ether Vial, which is probably the most important thing for me to do. And the Street Race are just redraws. Don't really feel like, even though these are 2 unknown cards, not going to 6 and having this Force, especially when I need to Force a Will or turn 1 Ether Vial. Boom. I cycle to try to find another blue card. I find Delver and Thoughtseize, but I decide I still want to pitch the Daze and deploy my pressure. It's funny, in Modern you always want to turn 1 Thoughtseize. In Legacy you basically almost always want to turn 1 Delver. Because even if the opponent, I figured if the opponent plays Stoneforge Mystic, I can Thoughtseize whatever they pick up. But the opponent just goes Mother of Runes, which I'd like to find removal for, but again, Delver Secrets lines up pretty well with Mother of Runes as long as your Delver sticks around. Find another Thoughtseize, so between triple Street Wraith, shocking myself, and then now double Thoughtseize, feeling a little pinched on life. Definitely take the Palace Jailer. There's some consideration in waiting on Thoughtseize to try and hit a Stoneforge Mystic, like Stoneforge Mystic getting like a Jitte or a Sword. In hindsight, I should have done that, This is kind of a punt because I absolutely don't care about Phyrexian Revoker. And now I'm at 5 life with a Mother Runes in play. And the thing I was talking about of top decking, leaving Thoughtseize in my hand for a top deck Stoneforge Mystic, immediately see me being punished here. The opponent has no cards in hand, but Sword of Fire and Ice is good enough, especially with Mother of Runes in play, and I'm suddenly feeling like I'm about to die. And I draw another Thoughtseize, and I'm just like, okay, I dealt myself 18 damage this game, and I have to take the Sword of Fire and Ice. Opponent's laughing, saying like, geez, and I'm like, yeah, I know, but I'm also at 3 life with a Mother of Runes and another threat in play. Feel like they can profitably erase my Delver. So I need the opponent to brick for like the rest of the game, and for me to draw nuts. They draw Wasteland, which I don't really care about anymore. So that's a brick. And I draw nuts. So you can no longer erase me, because, again, to erase me involves using Mother Runes, which means I can't block profitably when I have a 10-10 in play. Meanwhile, I'm still swinging in the air. So suddenly turned around to look for the looking good. As long as the opponent doesn't draw like Palace Jailer. They draw Thalia, which is a little scary. However, they decide to attack, which is a little weird. This seemed incorrect. Maybe the opponent was panicking, because yeah, I'm obviously going to block the Mother of Runes. I go to 2, but now I could just leave Aberration plus Thalia behind. Sorry, Aberration plus Shadow behind to basically trade for their board. Or even better, just leave Shadow behind. Anyway, that is because now how their attacks look is, hey, I have this lethal 11/11, and you have no cards in, like, I think they should have still been defensive, because now I have a lethal 11/11 that they have to block with Thalia. And yeah, they can attack me for 1 more Stoneforge Mystic. I'm going to keep attacking their life total with Delver. Then I'll just play another Delver. I decided to Wasteland their Wasteland just to make a top-decked Palace Jailer worse for them. / uncastable. I should have Wastelanded earlier, but that occurred to me on that turn. I was like, they can still top-deck Palace Jailer, which would be a nightmare. So I was like, I definitely want to make such that any top deck they have is either underpowered or uncastable. Looks like it's uncastable, except the center draws Swords to Plowshares, which at this point I'm actually pretty okay with, because I have opponents at 8, I have 3 power in the air, potentially 6, and now I'm going all the way back to 13, turning back on my fetch, and revealing Ponder. So now the opponent's looking really bad shape. 0 cards in hand with a Squire, and I have a Ponder. So the way that game just turned out was ridiculous. Obviously, the Mother of Runes attack wasn't very good, but I felt like they were in trouble anyway. Don't like any of these cards. I'd rather have a random card than a Brainstorm and 2 dead cards. And the opponent can't imagine what draws they'd have, so they have nothing and scoop it up. So that was crazy. Did not think I was going to win after putting myself to 3 life with an opponent having a Stoneforge and a Mother of Runes in play. And then, so currently 2-2, got half of my entry back. Once again, lots of like no landers that I have to mull, and this is a fine hand. Put back an extra shadow. Keep a Brazen Borrower because it can interact. And I end up playing against a deck that's most like a modern deck that I've ever seen in Legacy, which means Death Shadow is actually pretty good. Excuse me. I take Abrupt Decay because obviously that answers my shadow, but it's just like there's no blue, so they can't fix their hand after I discard their best card. They're playing Lightning Bolt, which doesn't line up well against my threats, and then everything else is basically I can go over the top with Shadow, which feels amazing after such a difficult league. The opponent taps out to play Sylvan Library, which I expected after taking Abrupt Decay, and I don't want them to draw extra cards with it until I have my threat in play, so I decide to main phase Petty Theft as a tempo play, because they'll probably have to spend their entire next turn replaying Sylvan Library, at which point I would have popped off 2 fetch lands to be able to deploy my Shadow. So now their Sylvan Library, sure, it will still draw them cards, but now they would be facing pressure from the Shadow. So that's the plan. Brazen Borrower, make them replay it, so I can basically have more time to put my 3rd fetch land into play for the Shadow, and that's exactly what happens. So now this is starting to feel like a modern match, where I'm making my opponent's plays clunky and being efficient. Brainstorm first, and I'm happy to find, so the opponent's hand at this point is just Lightning Bolt, Fiend Artisan, and 2 unknowns. And at this point, I'm happy to play 2 Shadows with Force of Will backup. The nice thing is you can actually keep 3 cards off the top with Street Wraith. Sorry, only put 1 card back by Street Wraithing. Yeah, play 2 4/4s. Underground Sea is nice in this deck as well, as opposed to if you want to get a painless fetch in Modern, it has to be a basic, but here having access to all the colors is nice. Opponent has Wasteland, which I don't care about anymore, although it would stop me from casting Brazen Borrower, but I still have my threats, and yeah, they're looking to Eternal Witness, Abrupt Decay, perfect Force of Will target, which grows my Shadows. And this, again, felt like a very modern-like matchup where I top deck a fetch land and now have lethal all of a sudden. Swing for 10, fetch shock, make them 8/8s, swing for 16. Game over. So that was kind of a nice match to end on after so many challenging and frustrating previous matches. Gotta play one that felt very modern-like, which is where Death Shadow definitely shines. Unkeepable hand again. A lot of no-lander hands, but that makes sense when you're playing only 14 colored sources. Hand's great. I put back the Angler for later since I have 2 threats already. The opponent doesn't play any scary cards really, so like I'm feeling very happy. Play my turn 1 Delver with Force of Will backup. Opponent Pyroblast, which I'm okay with. I'm playing a Shadow on turn 2, so which is unpyroblastable. They play Tarmogoyf, which I'm also okay with, because my Shadow will outgrow that pretty quickly. At this point, I draw enough removal, and their deck seems to not really care about the stack, i.e. I care more about answering what's on the battlefield. I'm happy to shuffle away Force of Will and either Thoughtseize, Eliminate, or Snuff Out. I was looking at thinking about what I want to do for my next turns. And while Eliminate's good in answering their board, it's a little clunky. I mean, I'm feeling like modern. I'm playing this efficient deck. It's a little clunky because this turn I want a Thoughtseize, a threat, and then Snuff Out a Tarmogoyf, and then next turn basically spend my turn deploying 2 giant Death Shadows. So I decided to put back Force of Will and Eliminate. Eliminate because it's clunky, Force of Will because I don't have another blue card, and I'm more rather trade 1 for 1. Discard Abrupt Decay. They have Catacombs, Forest, Plague Engineer, Abrupt Decay. I take the Abrupt Decay because I figure there's a chance I could draw a removal spell for Plague Engineer, and then I'll have these 2 giant Death Shadows. At the very least, it will trade, much like it would for Abrupt Decay. So I snuff out the Tarmogoyf. Snuff. I used to play Dismember in this deck. Snuff Out feels much better. Just the fact that it's free is insane. They want to play Plague Engineer to shut off future Death Shadows. Brainstorm, obviously a good draw. Not really much I want to keep, since I feel like most of their threats, their hand is Verdant Catacomb, something else, so they have their 4th land drop, so it feels unlikely I will daze something. And my life total was low enough, so I got rid of Street Wraith and decided just to get the double shadow down, 16 power, and hopefully the Brainstorm draws me into like Eliminate or something for the Plague Engineer, so I could just crash it for 16 damage, and fail to find it. Opponent Power Blast, which I'm happy about. I'm happy to take the trade here since I still have I feel like my threats outsize all of theirs. They get Dryad Arbor, which is a little scary. Abrupt Case, and I have no threats, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I'm almost dead. Unfortunate, so I need to find another threat right there. Fortunate to draw the Angler, because I know they have Lightning Bolt in this deck, so now I can protect myself with my top decked Gurmag Angler, and hopefully draw a blue source. Perfect. So now I can swing in with Gurmag Angler, they can chump it, which I'm fine, or they don't chump it and are dead next turn because I'm pinning them on having... The fact they attacked me with Dryad Arbor made me think they were trying to get my life total down to bolt me out of the game, and unless they have double lightning bolts, it's not going to happen. Opponent attacks me into lightning bolt range. I force the bolts, stabilize at 2 life, and the opponent is out of cards. So yeah, you know, going through the replay of the deck, actually, on looking at it, seemed to have played better than it felt when I actually played. Still feels way too risky to play in Legacy. Death Shadow, because your discard spells are not as they're tempo negative. Oh, let's pull up the list. They're tempo negative, and in a fair deck, there's so many ways for your opponent to interact with you. It doesn't really work out. We didn't really get to see the cool plays of Contentious Plan on Chalice of the Void, unfortunately. Nor did I effectively use Winter Orb, but maybe in a future league I'll get to try that out. Anyway, thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you guys next time.